So this bubble with causal principles can create anything it wants.
Logically, necessarily, from how I've described it. It's
How
inevitable.
is that not God?
Well, it doesn't have a mind.
Well,
It's
wait a
not
minute, wait a
thinking,
minute.
it's not intelligent.
How does something without a mind cause other things on its own
I
when
already
it's not being
explained
acted
that.
on and has the ability to do anything it wants? We can see computation without actually consciousness coming out or actually understanding or knowing. So you have computation. Okay, that doesn't actually show consciousness is coming out of it because we can see computation without it. So you have a correlation in the brain. I agree. That's not evidence of a causation. You say it is. I'm asking for that evidence. You've not given it so far.
We want to welcome Zach from Maine First, which is kind of the premier organization from New England fighting for conservative influence. So Zach is a sponsor for DebateCon 6 as well as Maine First, and we are so grateful for them because they believe in free speech and fair debates, just like modern day debate. But as I had mentioned, they also believe in fighting for conservatism. Welcome, Zach. We're thrilled to have you back with us to share about Maine First.
Thank you, James. And thank you very much for everyone who's here. Maine First Project is grateful for the opportunity to sponsor this event. And we at Maine First Project have been taking the fight to the leftists in Maine and have been fighting fire with fire. And the reason folks should really support Maine First Project is many of the leftist policies that have permeated throughout this country have stemmed from Maine, such as Trump being taken off the ballot, the trans agenda, illegal migrants, it's a big magnet for them, ranked choice voting, which a lot of states don't have that, but it will be coming to you soon, so watch out. So we'd love your support. Go to mainfirstproject.org and see what we're all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to jump into it. I'm going to introduce our debaters for this debate on whether or not God exists. First, as he'll be going first, Mike Jones runs the YouTube channel Inspiring Philosophy. He's a Christian apologist. He has a master's in philosophy from the University of Arizona, and he's debated the top atheist debaters in the world, such as Matt Dillahunty, Dr. Lawrence Krauss, Dr. Michael Shermer, and many more. Please join me in welcoming Inspiring Philosophy's Mike Jones. Also, please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Carrier, who is a world-renowned author and speaker, as a professional historian, published philosopher, and prominent defender of the American free thought movement. Dr. Carrier has appeared across the U.S., Canada, the UK, and Puerto Rico, and on American television and Canadian and London radio, defending sound historical methods and the ethical worldview of secular naturalism. Please welcome Dr. Richard Carrier. We are going to jump right into it. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being here. I have the timer set for you, Mike, for your 15-minute opening statement.
All right, thank you, James, and thank you, Dr. Carrier, for agreeing to the debate. I'll be arguing that God does exist, and we have more than enough evidence to establish this. I'll present 3 arguments for God's existence, and then make an argument from parsimony. But first, I'm going to argue idealism is true, which in a nutshell is the belief that all is fundamentally mind. We can infer this from what I would call the introspective argument. Okay, premise 1, the mind exists. No one with a mind can doubt this. As Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Premise 2, the mind and the properties of mind cannot reduce to matter. The hard problem of consciousness exists for a reason. There is no path forward to explain how consciousness could emerge from matter. Plus, everything we experience is qualia. Take bundle theory, for example, which is that physical objects exist as bundles of properties. For example, you could describe an apple as red, round, shiny, smooth, and tasty. But if you remove these properties, what is left? Well, nothing really. But these are all mental experiences, not physical. As Susan Schneider says, pure property ontologies need to take physical objects as metaphysically derivative, even objects that physics regards as fundamental. Objects are instead bundled out of properties, or they are properties. The atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel had to admit, If a mental event really is a physical event in the sense and nothing else, then the physical event by itself, once its physical properties are understood, should likewise be sufficient for the taste of sugar, the feeling of pain, or whatever it is supposed to be identical with. But it doesn't seem to be. It seems conceivable for any physical event, there should be a physical event without any experience at all. Experience of taste seems to be something extra continually related to the brain state. But we can't reduce the physical to the mental, because as we noted, everything we experience is mental. And using the logic of bundle theory and the binding problem, we can infer what constitutes as the physical can reduce to the mental. But as noted, the mental cannot reduce to the physical. Premise 3, substance dualism is false. As noted, there is no reason to posit a substance beyond the qualia we experience. And substance dualism suffers from issues like the interaction problem. Therefore, from the 3 premises, the conclusion would follow that all is mind, and that would mean idealism is true. If idealism is true, then our background knowledge makes it more likely that theism is true, and this will become apparent as I go through the 3 arguments. First, by God, I just want to say I mean a necessary immaterial mind whose nature would be ideal or absolute perfection. So the first argument is called the emergent universe argument. So if the universe is emergent, it's emergent from a mind. The universe is emergent, and therefore the universe is emergent from a mind. Pretty simple. I'll start by defending the second premise. The common belief today is the universe is fundamentally like particles or something like quarks, but quantum field theory doesn't show that. Physicist Walter Schmidt says particles are actually waves in different types of fields. This goes for all the particles we are made of. We are all just made of waves in a field. What looks to us as a billiard ball on a billiard table is actually a bunch of waves moving from the cue to the pocket. Now, some try to say, well, everything might reduce to quantum fields, but that doesn't work either, as the philosopher of physics David John Baker notes, that many of the problems that particle interpretations have also apply to field interpretations. And as other experts have noted, Baker's conclusions are pretty decisive to this day. Now, this can get complicated, but in a nutshell, there are mathematical problems with saying quantum fields are underlying objects, like the inability to assign Fock space to quantum fields, and other issues like spontaneous symmetry breaking. As Baker concludes, it seems that in many ways, fields and particle interpretations must stand or fall together. Next slide. So just appealing to fields to escape the problems that show particles cannot be fundamental doesn't work, because a lot of the same issues come up. Philosopher of science Minor Kuhlman notes physics lacks a coherent account of fundamental issues, such as the definition of objects. And it's not at all clear what a particle or field even is. Quantum field theory doesn't suggest fields are entities. Instead, at the most fundamental level, we only find structures, relations, and properties, not a material substance there. So this is one reason physicist James Glatfelter says the very notion of materialism now appears misguided. Our worldview is shattered. Philosopher Jan Westerhoff agrees. The moral to draw from the reductionist scenario seems to be that either what is fundamental is not material, or that nothing at all is fundamental. And I'm citing so many experts so you're aware this is not something I made up. It's coming from experts in the philosophy of physics. Essentially, our macro reality appears to be emergent from underlying information, not fundamental objects that we can call fields or particles, thus supporting the second premise. Now, as for the first premise, if all of material reality can reduce to mathematics, properties, and abstractions without any reference to a substance, then it can better fit with an idealist worldview, where the macro reality is merely emergent from information contingent on mind. Instead of positing an undetectable material substance to give rise to quantum fields and particles and then somehow builds conscious agents, we stick with what we know exists, consciousness and a material reality reducible to information. So shave off all mind-dependent objects and stick with what we know. Similarly, philosopher Doreen Fraser has to say about our reality, multiple lines of argument support the conclusion that quantum field theory does not describe a world that contains particles as fundamental entities. These arguments rely on special relativistic or general relativistic premises. I've added the proposal that particles be considered fictions in another sense. Particles and quasi-particles in condensed matter physics supply physical intuitions that are useful for formulating mathematical framework for quantum field theory, but which do not represent the world even approximately. So no need to posit some sort of substance beyond that. We stick with an idealist ontology. Mind is fundamental, and the physical is just information or qualia. Next, we can use another correlation using quantum cognition, and this will be an inductive argument. In 2009, physicist Diederik Erch published a paper noting that our cognitive processes can be readily modeled using the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics. Now, this is not just hypothetical. Psychologists have been applying quantum cognition to their field and finding it is more successful than traditional models and has provided principled answers to the puzzles and challenges. My opponent knows of quantum cognition is independent from quantum mind research, and he's endorsed the field recently. However, the point I'm getting at is that if our inner mental world can be modeled in terms of quantum processes, similar processes that give rise to space-time and matter, that means space-time and matter are emergent from the underlying quantum world, but our inner mental world of consciousness and mind can be modeled via quantum processes through the study of quantum cognition. This would suggest that what space-time emerges from would be similar or indistinguishable from that of a mind, or something that looks and acts an awfully lot like a mind. But I'd say the most parsimonious explanation is the universe is just emergent from a mind, instead of it emerging from something that isn't a mind, yet resembles and acts like a mind. In private correspondence with one researcher in this field, he said it could all just be a coincidence, but the correlations, i.e., the similarity in behavior between human concepts interacting with human minds and quantum entities interacting with fermionic matter, could be caused by the fact that both entities share the same conceptual nature. This can also be strengthened through the research in quantum mind theory, which I don't have time to cover now. But we can also look at the work of astrophysicist Franco Vazza and neurosurgeon Alberto Felitti, who wrote a paper on the similarities between neural networks and the cosmic web of galaxies. And they show that the properties of neural networks within the human cortex are similar to the cosmic web of galaxies, something we would expect if the universe is emergent from a mind. This is less likely if physicalism is true, but it would be predicted by idealism. Because, as philosopher of mind Bernardo Kastrup notes after drawing on their works, brains are the images or representations of conscious minds. Elsewhere, he says a brain, or the whole body by extension, is just the external appearance of a conscious agent. If the universe is emergent from a mind, we would expect the universe would in some way be the external appearance of that conscious agent in the way your brain, on idealism, is the external appearance of you. So we have good reason to support the first premise as well. Now, as for the second argument, start here. It's called it's a consciousness argument. Premise one, contingent minds have either a personal explanation or a natural explanation. Theories of mind will fall into one of these two categories, or a mix, I guess you could suppose. And by personal explanation, I mean that if our consciousness cannot be reduced to natural processes or parts, and is irreducible as is, then it must come from a personal source. Premise two, idealism is true, and thus all is reducible of mind. There are various ways I could argue for this. I can refer you to the prior arguments, but for the sake of time, I need to move on. So this would mean that if all is mind, one's individual consciousness cannot be reduced to natural parts or processes that are not mental in nature. Therefore, conclusion one, a natural explanation cannot be the reason for contingent minds. Premise three, the explanation of contingent conscious minds is a personal explanation. And then the source would be a necessary personal source. Idealist philosophers seem to be recognizing this fact one way or another. Bernardo Kastrup says the whole universe is a mind, but not in your individual psyche alone, for mind extends far beyond the boundaries of personal introspection. Helen Yetter-Chappell says external reality is a vast unity of consciousness independent from all finite minds. But this would lead to a theistic conclusion. If all is mind and yet we are individually contingent, then we still must come from somewhere, but we as conscious agents are irreducible to smaller parts that make up our consciousness. It would reasonably follow our minds come from a greater mind that is the grounding of all contingent minds. Therefore, this is who we would call God, therefore God exists. Now, the final argument I'll present is the moral argument. Premise one, non-natural moral realism is true. This is the view that moral facts exist objectively and are not reducible to natural properties like happiness or anything in nature. They cannot be natural because of issues like the is-ought problem or G.E. Moore's open question argument. Something that is in nature is not evidence of something we ought to do. But as numerous philosophers note, moral realism is intuitive, and the way that moral values and duties manifest in reality implies they are objective. So, moving on, premise two, if objective moral values and duties exist, they are personal in nature. Take moral prescriptions. They do not exist in physical nature. The natural world only contains descriptions. Prescriptions exist between minds. I could prescribe you the task of guarding me at this event. But that prescription exists between two minds. So if we are bound to objective prescriptions, that implies they come from a prescriber. As Peter S. Williams says, I have moral obligations, but since I can't be obligated by anything non-personal, e.g. the evolutionary history of my species, I must be obligated by something personal. Since there are objective moral obligations that transcend all finite persons or groups thereof, there must therefore be a transcendent personal reality to whom we are fundamentally obligated. Take the moral ideal. If there is an objective moral ideal, you will picture an agent who always acts right and is perfectly virtuous. But that is necessarily an agent, not mere abstract principles divorced from something personal. If there is an objective ideal, it would be a perfect moral agent. From a perfect mind would come perfect principles of behavior. Take moral guilt. Peter S. Williams says, since it would be inappropriate to feel guilt or shame before an abstract, impersonal moral principle, and since it is appropriate to feel guilt and shame before the objective moral law, that moral law cannot be an abstract moral principle. In other words, objective moral values must be ontologically grounded in a transcendent personality, before whom it is appropriate to feel moral guilt. So the very ontology of objective moral values and duties are personal in nature. Premise 3, if objective moral values and duties are personal, then they are grounded in a personal source. Premise 4, this personal source is what we call God. Now it is more parsimonious to posit one entity which encompasses all of objective moral values and duties, rather than multiple ones. So we can simply posit objective goodness itself, which would encompass all values and duties, and that would be personal in nature. Therefore, God exists. Now, I fully expect my opponent will be able to come up with alternative explanations to the point I raised. But a major obstacle for him is offering an alternative explanation of reality that is more plausible and parsimonious. What I mean is I suspect he will have an alternative explanation for consciousness, for moral realism. I read his paper recently, and the contingency of the universe. But notice what will happen. He will be demonstrating theism is more parsimonious, because we can explain all this data with one explanation. A fundamental mind exists, which explains why the universe exists, why consciousness exists, why moral realism exists, and many other aspects of reality I don't have time to cover here, like other issues, for example. So theistic idealism has better explanatory scope, power, plausibility, is the least ad hoc. Unless my opponent can offer a simpler explanation that can account for all this data I presented, we will have to conclude that theism is the best explanation of reality until we can come up with more data. Now, my opponent has said on his blog that in articles like The Problem of Nothing and his reply on Kuhn's cosmology, that he thinks an absolute nothing brought about the universe. Not what Lawrence Krauss says, he's very clear about that, but in literal absolute nothing. He says in his blog post, Kuhn's cosmology, whereas if you just let it go without any intelligent control, then a nothing will almost certainly collapse into something. That is absurd, though. That's like saying 0 plus 2 equals 1,000,000. It doesn't make any sense. To collapse into something, it has to be something. He's also said an actual nothing is therefore even more likely to randomly create rabbits and Death Stars in his article, The Problem of Nothing, which is, of course, absurd. That doesn't make any sense. This is what he has offered as an alternative to theism as an explanation for why there is something rather than nothing, I guess, or why the universe exists. But this is absurd. He will need to defend this tonight against a theistic proposal, show that is more plausible, more parsimonious, and in fact is logically coherent. Let's remember the Duhem-Quine thesis, no theory can be confirmed in isolation from its background assumptions. If that's one of his background assumptions, he'll need to defend that as a better explanation than theism. Thank you.
Thank you for that opening mic. We will kick it over to Dr. Richard Carrier. I have the timer set for you on your first word, Dr. Carrier, for your opening.
All right, first mic check, though. Does this sound good? Sounds good. If I sit right here, we're all right. Okay, I'm ready to start.
Perfect.
So the big question here is that we have to start with how we decide what is true. So in terms of best explanations, better and worse explanations. So a good explanation will have parsimony, as Michael said. It will have fewer, parsimony means fewer assumptions. So you're starting with a simpler model to explain more complex models rather than the other way around. Another thing that you're looking at is precedent. what has usually turned out to be the explanation of things? So, for instance, God does not usually turn out to be the explanation of things. No supernatural agent usually turns out to be the explanation of things. When we investigate what explains lightning, evolution, the species of animals, and so on, we always find natural causes. So we should expect natural causes for any future explanation that we haven't caught at yet. Now, that doesn't prove it. It's just this is a good explanation. A good explanation builds on precedents that we already have, and it starts with simpler hypotheses than we're trying to explain. And the third principle is that if the evidence is more likely on your explanation, in other words, if it's exactly what you expect on your explanation, then that's good evidence for your theory. Whereas if that evidence is not quite as expected on an alternative theory, then your theory is better than that other theory. How much better depends on how much the evidence is unexpected on that other theory. That's how you compare quality of evidence. Strong evidence is when the evidence is exactly what you expect on your theory and not at all what you expect on the alternate theory. Small evidence that teeters in a correct direction, one direction, but isn't overwhelmingly powerful. That kind of evidence is maybe slightly expected on the alternative explanation, but it's totally expected on your explanation. So when we do these kinds of comparisons, we want to look for these three things: precedent, simplicity, and how likely is the evidence overall. And we've got to bring all the evidence in. We can't leave evidence out when we ask these questions. So I'm going to test Michael's case using these principles. Also, I should point out that I'm going to defend naturalism. Every time I say atheism, I mean naturalism. I'm not defending supernatural atheisms or any other form of atheism, and that matters because if we define naturalism as the view that mindless natural causes explain everything that happens or exists, then that leads to certain predictions about what can and can't happen and what we can expect and not expect. And that will matter as we continue through this argument. So let's look at Michael's arguments here then. So he starts with this idea of idealism, and that mind cannot reduce to matter. I think what he really means is what we call in philosophy qualia, which is a particular term for what it is like to be conscious. We can explain everything about mind, like thinking and reason and understanding and knowledge and stuff, without reference to qualia. So I think what he's referring to is qualia, the state of it, the redness of red, the smell of an apple, and things like that. What it's like to be conscious. His argument is that cannot reduce to matter. Now, I actually, there are several people, Daniel Dennett and Alan Cottrell and Patricia Churchland and many others, Andrew Melnick, Yegwon Kim, and so on, have all argued that you actually can reduce qualia to essentially computational physics, physical operations of the brain as a computer in a sense. And so we know it's theoretically possible to do this. And I actually do it in a much more specific way, explaining how qualia is an inevitable outcome of processing distinctions in the world. So when you are building a model, when your brain is building a model of the world that you're in, it has to make distinctions between things in that model: vision, hearing, colors, shapes, distances, and so on. The very fact of computing those things cannot be experienced any other way than as qualia. So that, in fact, qualia are an inevitable product of any model computing, which means that certain robots we've built that do this kind of modeling probably also experience qualia. Now, of course, they won't experience in relation to a person because what we are is a model of ourselves. So, and we have a lot of evidence for this from mind-brain physics about how the model can go wrong, which teaches us what is actually happening in terms of how our mind is building a model. Our brain is building a model of what's going on in itself. The brain is actually trying to model what's going on in itself, and it can make mistakes doing that, and it can make mistakes in a way that only makes sense if what it's doing is trying to build that model and making those mistakes sometimes when it does. So even the relation to yourself, the qualia of consciousness itself, that you are a person seeing a thing and hearing a thing and thinking about other versus you, even that is a product of model building. And there's no other way it could be like than to do that. And maybe we'll get more into that in rebuttals and so on. But that's the basic position I take. And for those who want to find the breadcrumb to begin following all my articles on that, my article, Touch All the Way Down, is the key article to go for that. And I'm not alone in making these arguments. This is, like I said, many physicists and philosophers have done this. In fact, most philosophers, according to the latest Phil Papers survey, are physicalists, mind-brain physicalists like me. We think it can all reduce to matter as essentially in some form an inevitable product of computing. So that gets rid of the first part of Michael's argument. Then he gets into the quantum consciousness argument. Before I get to that, though, I want to bring in evidence that was left out. And this is key here. If we want to understand things correctly, we can't leave evidence out. We've got to bring it back in. And when we look at all the evidence, then we can decide what is a better explanation for all that. So if we take the argument from consciousness generally, like the usual version of this argument, if God does not exist, the only way minds could exist is as the output of a complex physical machine that evolved slowly by natural selection over hundreds of millions of years, from ultra-simple worm brains to fish brains to lizard brains, mammal brains, monkey brains, ape brains, hominid brains, and eventually human brains, which is exactly what we observe. The only way consciousness exists on atheism is as complex evolved computers, and we observe complex evolved computers. And we know this because we can take parts out of the brain or deactivate parts of the brain, and we lose the qualia, we lose the consciousness element that it was controlling. So we know the brain is actually generating consciousness as a computation in some sense. Now, God would have no need of this. He could just install disembodied minds in our body. No delicate, easily damaged, nutrient, oxygen-hogging brain. We wouldn't need that. It would just be a soul in control of the body. If I was God, I could do that easily, and there would be a lot of actually moral reasons why I would prefer that, to make people that way. And certainly God could make it that way. And the key thing here is, if naturalism is true, we could not be made that way. If naturalism is true, the only way we could be made, and therefore if we wake up in a naturalist world, a world without God, obviously we're there, we're conscious, the only way that could be is if we have a complex machine that evolved after millions and millions of years to produce that thing. That's the only thing that could exist on naturalism, and yet that's exactly what we observe. Whereas on God, on theism, that isn't the only way we could observe. It's not even the most likely way that we would exist and observe. We would be disembodied minds. And by the way, if we had that, if we had no brain, we could locate no physical organ whose computations can explain anything we're doing, and yet we're conscious, etc. That would actually be really good evidence for God, or at least the supernatural. And so, but we don't have that. We have, surprisingly, exactly what we would expect if there was no God, which means God had to specifically go out of his way to design the world to look exactly like a world without God in it, which now you have to explain why he would make a strange decision like that. So this is the reason why the argument from consciousness, when you put the evidence back in, actually the evidence is more probable on naturalism than on theism, and therefore that actually ends up being evidence for naturalism against theism. Now, if we get to the specifics of qualia, all the particulars of qualia, redness, smells, even emotions like awe. I have an article on the evolution of awe on my site. You can check that out for a breadcrumb on that. All the particulars of qualia track specific evolutionary stories confirmed in genetics, animal behavior, and comparative neuroanatomy. So we actually know that there are parts of the brain responsible for generating these kinds of qualitative experiences. And we know they evolved gradually over time, and we know why they evolved, why they got selected to survive and others didn't. Now, qualia come and go with the parts of the brain that generate each, in animals as well as humans. And again, in Touch All the Way Down, I show that qualia appear to be the inevitable outcome of computing models, and so we don't really need God to explain any of this, and therefore we don't get the premise that Michael needs on this. When we get to the quantum consciousness argument, I think a lot of that depends on philosophers like Kastrup and those who want to actually follow that up. I have an article on Bernard Kastrup's idealism, so that's a great breadcrumb for you to start into that adventures. Michael's aware of this, and so that's the place I would go. I'm limited on clock, so I can't go into detail on that. But the basic idea is, if he's starting with the idea that we can't explain what particles are, or what waves are, or whatever. That's not really inherently a problem in physics because we have lots of theories as to what they are. Just because we don't know which theory is true doesn't mean that we don't have a theory, or that we can't explain it. So I'm going to pick an explanation. It doesn't mean I think this explanation is necessarily true. I don't think we proved it yet. My only point in presenting this explanation is to show that we do have possible explanations. It could be true. There could be other physical explanations that are true, that turn out to be actually true. So I'm just presenting basically a possibility here to show that we actually have possible ways to explain this. And one is if we do superstring theory fundamentally to space-time. In other words, all waves, all particles, etc., actually reduce to waves in space-time through manifolds that are at the Planck scale. They're really small. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice here. So if you can look into superstring theory, but if you do superstring theory with waves of space-time, you can end up explaining all the phenomena of quantum mechanics, and therefore all particles, the whole standard model, and so on. And really it comes down to how do things change direction or move, essentially. So for instance, solidity, the table, this thing right here, really this is force fields. We see it as a solid object, but it's actually mostly empty space. And what we're feeling, what's stopping my finger from going through this podium, is actually a force field, and we can explain that. Oh, I have one, thank you. But thank you so much. So we can explain that in physics that way. So we don't actually have this problem that we can't explain particles, we can't explain things. We actually have those things. And a good example is when Michael says that you can reduce things to mathematical formalisms. It's worth pointing out that all mathematical formalisms describe physical behaviors. So really a formalism is just a description of what's happening physically. And that means that the formalism corresponds to some physical thing. So you can't argue from the fact that a mathematical formula describes a thing that there's no physical thing being described. It actually is a physical thing being described. Force fields is one of these. Force fields arising from space-time, warping of space-time at small scales and so on. All of this would work. So there's not really a problem coming up with an explanation. He gave another example of the cosmic web and the mind. This is a thing that, again, I don't have time to go into it in great detail. You can Google this and look into it to find what are the explanations of this. So look for scientists and physicists talking about it, not the sensationalists. And what you'll find when you do that is that it's actually a thermodynamic effect of systems evolving by deterministic physics into the most efficient geometric structures. So the same kinds of thermodynamic action that builds stellar clusters is also pushing the cells of our brain to organize in a certain way, because that's the most efficient way to do the thing that the brain is doing. And when it comes to the arrangement of galaxies in space, it's the most efficient way for the exchange of energy. So it actually just sort of forms that way naturally. It's very similar to the fractal physics that we find in like the formation of trees and the way their branches go, and then compared to the way that coastlines look and so on. It's just deterministic physics actually explains it. There's nothing special about it, and it doesn't mean that the universe is a giant brain or anything like that. It couldn't do that because information doesn't travel around it fast enough for it to think. So when we look at all of this, we see consciousness is a process caused by physical processes. The history, all of the physics, all of the neuroanatomy, everything we've learned tells us this. And so it is reducible to those systems. There's no reason to believe that it's not. So that takes care of all of that stuff. And I think, is there anything more I want to go into before I continue? No, I think I'll skip. How much time do I have? 1 minute. Okay, the is-ought problem, real quick. We'll get to the lucky God problem later, hopefully in rebuttals. So the is-ought problem, that's actually been solved for a while. This is a misunderstanding of what Hume said. We prove oughts from ises all the time. So like if you want to build a bridge that will stand up, you ought to act a certain ways. If you're a surgeon who wants to save the patient's life, you ought to sterilize your instruments. So we can easily reduce oughts to ises. And so the question is, what would be a moral reduction? What would be a moral imperative instead of just these utilitarian imperatives? Moral imperatives are the oughts that arise from the things that supersede all other imperatives. So empirically proving imperatives is something that we've done. I have a paper on this about all objective moral facts exist in all possible universes. That was published in Religions. Michael referenced that. I would recommend you check that for the complete starter case on it, and it's available free. It's not behind a paywall. Anyway, so the is-ought problem doesn't create a problem for us because empirically proving oughts in science does that all of the time. I have other arguments to make on that, but I think I'm running out of time. Is that the... That's right. Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much for that opening as well, Dr. Carrier. Mm-hmm. We will switch it into the rebuttal mode. I wanted to take a moment to say thank you to our friends at Maine First Project for sponsoring DebateCon 6, as they also believe in the values of free speech and fair debate. Maine First Project is fighting for conservatism in New England and beyond, so check out their link in the description box below. This is 10 minutes. I have the timer set for you, Mike, on your first word.
All right, thank you, Dr. Carrier. I really appreciate that. I want to start out by saying I know I'm totally aware we have a limited time, so I would please press you to use that limited time to offer a better explanation other than just random possibilities. As I said in my opening statement, there are plenty of possibilities we could posit. Why is that a better explanation given the data? If we have different aspects of reality, emergent nature of the universe, contingency, consciousness, moral realism, can even throw in things like fine-tuning or reason, we can explain all that with theism. If we want to posit various different other possibilities, that would be actually conceding, because that's my point. You have to do that, and that just shows that you're not actually offering a plausible and parsimonious explanation. He said supernatural explanation is not an explanation. I want to rebut that by saying, could you define what natural and supernatural are? How do we distinguish this? Because I think there's a lot of gray in that, and these terms are not properly defined. He said physicalist philosophers have argued qualia can reduce to computational physics. I don't think I disagree. I'd like you to explain more on that. My point was that qualia does not reduce to a material substance. So if you have an idealist ontology, we experience qualia, which I would say could be reduced to information. Totally agree. Not a problem there. So I don't see that as really challenging what I said. You said minds can exist out of being complex machines, or they're complex evolved computers on your view. That needs to be justified. We just can't say brain, magic, therefore consciousness. We have the hard problem of consciousness for a reason. If you're going to posit a physical theory, you're not going to say consciousness is fundamental. You need to explain how it emerges. Okay? My argument is that it can't, and it's best explained as a personal explanation because of issues like that, and because the very nature of consciousness cries out for a personal explanation. So we need more than just, well, it happened. I need actual data for that, because there is no evidence that brains are actually generating consciousness. Correlation is not causation. We have correlations in the brain. Idealists predict that. Physicalists can predict that. That doesn't change anything. Now, we need to talk more about your whole worldview, because you're trying to argue that naturalism is more probable given what we observe. I would argue that on your entire worldview, it isn't. You said in your article, Kuhn's Cosmology, you said this reifies the principle of indifference, but the reification is a logical necessary outcome of the state of nothing as described. It is the absence of all limits and controls. All logical possibilities are ontologically possible outcomes. And in the absence of anything rendering one outcome more likely than another, every outcome must necessarily be equally probable. In other words, because you are arguing from this nothing state, which you've not defended yet here, you have to say, and you've said, everything is equally probable. So how could you say the universe we observe is more probable on your worldview? It isn't. You've said everything is equally probable. So if everything's equally probable, nothing is probable. So you can't say that on your worldview, the universe we observe is more probable. Now, he talked about, well, why did God design the universe this way and not another way? You can correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm misunderstanding you there. This flows out of two principles: the nature of God and axiology, which is the study of value. God is going to create value, things that are valuable. Bodies have value. Creating a universe that slowly evolves or slowly gets better has value. Creating creatures that can come to learn and study the universe has value in that. God is going to create value, analogous to a author who creates various different worlds and stories. There are value in those. Some may be better than others, some are not. They're still creating value through those stories. God, who is perfectly good, would also want to increase value, and that is what he's doing. He's increasing value in how he's creating. We don't need to posit that he created a certain way or another way. Imagine if, like, to give an analogy, let's say we came across a crime scene, and there was a guy there. We found video footage of a murder in the room with him for an hour, and then he stabbed him and walked out. And we're like, well, we know a murder committed. It'd be absurd for us to say, no, because that couldn't have happened. The murderer could have created elaborate saw exercises from the movie and puzzles and schemes and tortured him. Why would he just have stabbed him? It doesn't matter. We may not know the intentions or the thoughts of that murder, but we know a murder happened. Likewise, we have evidence in this universe that God exists. We can point to it. So that still follows. So again, And I didn't say we need God to explain qualia. That was a first initial argument arguing for idealism. So idealism is what I was basically positing. That what we see in terms of qualia, there's no need to posit a physical substance beyond the mind, is my point. A second substance. I'm not a substance dualist. I'm an idealist. All is mind. So I would call myself a dual aspect idealist. You posited superstring theory. Well, that's highly speculative. Physicist Tom Hartsfield has published a lot of articles arguing that string theory is circling the drain. He said this in 2014. It's riddled with problems. But even if string theory turns out to be true, this isn't a challenge to my view, because string theory would be a scientific theory, not a metaphysical theory or hypothesis, if you want to use that term. Okay? Could be perfectly posited. We need to actually show that the strings themselves refer to an actual underlying physical substance. So we have that problem there. Well, I'm going on what we actually have, though, which is in quantum field theory. And as of now, we have no reason to posit some sort of underlying substance there. It's just information at the bottom point, which would align more with an idealist perspective, and specifically a theistic idealist perspective. Now, to be clear, many of the physicists I quoted, I'm not saying they're theists. I'm saying the implications of what they're saying, though, better aligns with theism. So again, if there is some sort of underlying physical thing that explains all of reality, then we need evidence for that. And then we also need to know why it is non-sentient. If the underlying foundation of reality is able to create a complex universe, it can't be acted upon. It has to somehow act on its own to bring about the universe. It sounds an awfully lot like God. That's my point. And of course, we talked a little bit about the quantum cognition correlation. To recap, gave a couple different points here. Actually, it was the Franco Vazza and Felitti argument that we see the way the brain is is similar to the cosmic web of galaxies. Now, Vazzo and Felitti are basically saying that, Bernardo Kastrup by extension, saying that, look, idealism says the brain or the body is just the emergent picture of what you look like as a conscious agent. If you're in a physical space-time, you look like something, it's going to look like a brain or you by extension. Likewise, if idealism is true and the universe emerges from a mind, the brain itself would be the physical appearance in the same way your brain is the physical appearance of you. Now, in response to that, he said it's arranged in the most efficient way. Well, there are many ways to arrange efficiency. We have created very complicated computers, and now quantum computers, that are not arranged in the way our brains are arranged. So network efficiency is not necessary in the current way that our brain are designed. So we need another reason as to why the structure is the way it is and why it resembles a mind. Just being at network efficiency, I agree. Now I want to ask, why does the universe on a godless view have to have network efficiency? What's the point of that? This is an arbitrary assumption. This is another brute fact being posited here. Whereas it's theism, as I pointed out, we're positing a far less brute fact, which is important. So again, what I'm arguing is I'm saying that on theism, we have a well-rounded explanation that can account for multiple lines of data, as I presented in my opening statement, and it's a very simple and parsimonious explanation. Now, he did talk about simplicity. He might get to a specified complexity argument coming up. If he does that, though, he's going to have to take that to its logical extreme and posit solipsism. Because why posit beyond himself complex minds when he could just posit them as figments of his own mind's imagination? Sometimes positing complexity is necessary. For example, physicists posit a multiverse to explain fine-tuning. That is vastly complex to just explain the fine-tuning. So just positing complexity is not wrong. We have to posit something that accounts for all the data. And sometimes we have to posit things that are more complex. This is why we got quantum mechanics. Newtonian physics wasn't accounting for all the data. We had to come up with something else. Physicists posit a multiverse. Why? Because of complexity, fine-tuning that needs explained. So we need to have an explanation that accounts for all the data. And I would say, given the data, the best explanation is a mind. And I can argue that the mind itself, from philosophers like Richard Swinburne, Dr. Joshua Sijuwati, actually has a very simple ontology. Again, it's just perfect being theism. We don't have to posit complex parts, because the mind is not composed of physical parts. So it's actually a much simpler explanation. And I hope we get more into that, because there's more I want to talk about. Finally, you said consciousness is a process. Question, who am I talking to? How is that different than talking to a river or an avalanche? Consciousness, if it were just processes, this is a meaningless conversation. There's no agents here. He brought up the Izot problem, but he only talked about hypothetical imperatives. Yeah, no one denies that hypothetical imperatives can be explained naturally, but we're talking about moral oughts. And you can't get around that. This is why I brought up the open question argument, because I can just ask, why is something natural good? And this also doesn't account for the argument I gave, which is that when we look at the very ontology of moral values and duties, objective goodness, it's personal in nature, which is what we call God. So why would the very ontology of moral values and duties appear to be personal and not also be God? It doesn't. It seems like, again, we need another ad hoc explanation to account for that. But I think I'm out of time, so I'll just yield the last few seconds. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mike, for that rebuttal session. We'll switch over to Dr. Carrier for his 10-minute rebuttal as well. The floor is yours.
All right. So, do we have a better explanation for the data? And that is actually what the point that I made. Let's go back through them. Precedent. So, when we look at how things end up getting explained in the past 2,000 years of what we've done in terms of explaining the world, the least likely explanation is always supernatural. The most likely explanation is natural. So we have the background of precedent saying that any further thing that we need to explain is more likely, based on precedent, to have a natural explanation. That's item number one. That's why naturalism has one epistemic merit to it on that point. Then there's simplicity. I'm glad Michael asked about this. So where are we getting this simplicity idea? So if you look at like fine-tuning or something like that, it's either a lucky universe or a lucky God. Can you tell me which one is more lucky? So a lucky universe would just have a finite specified complexity because the universe is not infinite. The actual structure of the universe fundamentally is very simple relative to a God's mind, for example. So the universe is actually less lucky than God because God actually has infinite specified complexity. So if you think of like all the possible arrangements of knowledge, including one piece of false information versus a million pieces of false information, different kinds of false information, and God is supposed to know everything, or at least everything it's possible to know, which it would give you a number of connections that is equal to Aleph Omega in terms of infinity. It's the highest possible cardinality of infinity. The thing is that God is only one item out of all possible infinite options. So if you're going to randomly pick a mind or a universe or something like that, almost all of them are going to have false information, less information, etc. They're not going to be a God mind. There's only one option that is God that's absolutely perfect to every connection, to every single thing that he has in his mind, every memory, every piece of reasoning, every connection he makes between two things. Every single thing has to be perfect. There's only one to a field of options of infinite. In fact, Aleph Omega infinite, super, super infinite. So the probability, the simplicity of God is not there. God is literally the most complex thing, has the highest specified complexity that anything can have, possibly. And so you'd have to explain why that exists. Whereas a lucky universe has a finite specified complexity, and it's vastly less, so it's infinitely more likely, infinitely more simple by any system that you choose. So you can pick any kind of starting cosmology, Guth or Vilenkin. They have different models that start with very simple principles, entails multiverses, by the way. They don't just posit multiverses. They start with a simple set of physical rules and principles, way simpler than God's mind, way simpler than God's power, simpler than anything you could think of. It's one of the simplest things that you can get. Now, it's not like one digit simple, but it is simple compared to God. And when you start with that assumption, then you get multiverses, and therefore you get universes like ours, because fine-tuning is washed out by so many replications. So with a very simple model, and that's what populates cosmological science today. There's no God theories in cosmological science because none of them actually have this epistemic virtue of being based on precedent and actually having this simplicity. So that's why our explanation actually is vastly simpler than the God explanation. And there's no way to get God to sort of magically be more likely out of this because we would need something like an absolute proof that there's no possible way God couldn't exist. And philosophers will tell you that no one has really successfully done that. Now, there's actually one particular model. I have an article called "What if we theorize?" I can't remember the exact title, but it's "What if we imagine nothing as a field state?" And there, I actually cite scientists in a published paper. It's Lincoln and Wasser. So if you go there, you can find the Lincoln Wasser paper about creation ex nihilo in dark matter physics. And they show that you can start with a very, very simple set of assumptions. In other words, you start with the assumption that there are no physical laws yet. The inevitable result you can work out deductively is unstable. So that state without any physical laws means there's no laws to keep it that way. It can't stay nothing because there's no law that says or forces it to stay nothing. So it's actually extremely unstable and has to collapse. And so what they show is that when that happens, you end up with something like a Guth or Vilenkin model, where you end up with some sort of simple multiverse cosmology that starts from a very simple beginning that collapses out of nothing naturally, inevitably. And it's entirely logically coherent. It has just very few posits to get it to do that. It's probably one of the simplest models that I've seen in terms of cosmology, and it's certainly way simpler. Just assume a few statements, and it entails everything that we observe. And that's way simpler than God. Just saying we just have God for no reason. God is a way more complex thing. So we have no precedent for God, and God is way more complex than we need an explanation to be. Those are the reasons that we need to get rid of that concept. Okay, so that's that. How much time do I have? Okay. All right, so let's rush through these. I've got a ton of time. So we get to really quickly go back over the consciousness point. Remember, the brain has to be a complex machine. Remember, it evolves slowly over time. Remember that we know the parts are necessary. The actual working parts are necessary for each piece of qualia that we experience in our consciousness. These are all things that would be absolutely expected. In fact, they would have to be the case if naturalism is true. Surprise, surprise, that's what we observe. But they're not necessary if God exists. God wouldn't even use this mechanism. But even if he had some reason to, you can't prove that it's 100% chance that he would choose this way of doing it as opposed to all the ways that he has, whereas this is conveniently the only way it could be if naturalism is true. So it starts to look weird why God is creating the universe in exactly the way that looks like a universe without a God in it. And you can show this with cosmology, with fine-tuning, with biogenesis, over and over again. All of the things turn out exactly the way we would expect, the only way that it would be if naturalism was true, but not the way it would, not certainly the way it would be if God were doing it. So that's why that argument actually holds up and actually hits the third principle, which is evidence is more expected on naturalism. The same evidence Michael's referring to, when we put the evidence he leaves out back in, it ends up where we get evolution of the brain anatomy, the brain's complexity, its necessity, each part of necessity for each part of consciousness. All of that is evidence that is more likely on naturalism. So that's why we get to that. And when we get to the things like what is the difference between a river and a mind, they're both processes. Obviously, different processes work with different causal systems. The brain is arranged in a particular way to have a particular causal system that a river is not arranged in that way. This is entirely physics, so there's not really anything I have to explain there. Different processes work differently because they're arranged physically differently to have different causal effects throughout them, and that's pretty simple to do. And we can show that also with the cosmology, the organization of galaxies. I didn't say that we just posit that they're seeking thermodynamic efficiency. What I meant was that you can actually do the math and show that it is an inevitable outcome. When you start the system and it inevitably condenses into that structure through deterministic physics. So there's no like posit or assumption about this. This is just an inevitable process. Once you have the starting rules, the end result is inevitable. It requires no intelligent assembly or design. And also with string theory, the model that I used just now was where ripples in space-time itself, not strings. So in fact, he said there's no underlying physical substance. Well, the physical substance underlying everything is space-time itself on that model. This is a different model than, for example, quantum field theory, which has space-time being emergent. The superstring camp actually thinks space-time is fundamental and fields are emergent. And if you take that position, then what is fundamental to everything is space-time. That's actually everything. All particles, all fields, all force fields, everything is just twistings of space-time, and it explains everything that we have. So we can reduce everything that way. That's at the basement, space-time is all there is, and so on. And then all you need is what can expand space-time, what can twist it up, and so on. And that's when we get to Lincoln-Wasser, and that's where we get Guth and Vilenkin, and so on. We have all these cosmological theories that work. They're fine. He asks to defend the nothing argument. I don't have time to go into the specifics of it, but the nothing argument is similar to that Lincoln-Wasser argument that I mentioned before, which is that once you define a state of nothing correctly, where there's no laws governing what will happen, it inevitably happens that everything has an equal probability, but that does not mean that you're going to get everything. So I think this is a confusion that Michael is making. He mentioned Death Stars and rabbits earlier. Actually, so like if you were to pick of all random universes, every possible one, infinitely many different arrangements. Death stars and rabbits are they're like infinitely improbable. They're like the least likely things that you'll ever get. If you pick randomly several from there, most of the things you're going to pick are going to be sort of messy, semi-messy, complicated universes like ours. So there's not really a problem with rabbits and Death stars. That's not really a thing. The issue is that when you look at fields of probability, if you're randomly picking from there, eventually you're going to pick a universe like ours, sufficiently like ours, relevantly like ours. You're not going to pick rabbits and Death stars. They're extremely improbable compared to the fields of things. And that's because it's the specific different ways to configure the universe to produce life is actually, there are infinitely many ways to do that. And so you're not picking one thing out of an infinite array. You're actually picking randomly from all of that stuff. And when we get to the moral oughts, what is the question? Michael agrees hypothetical imperatives are empirical physical facts. Moral oughts are just the imperatives that you ought to follow over all other oughts, and so you get to moral theory in terms of reciprocity and so on. Time, you said? Yeah.
That's right. Thank you very much for that rebuttal. And now we're going to go into our final rebuttal. These are only 5 minutes. Got the timer set for you. Mike, the floor is all yours.
All right, a lot to get through. So he says space-time is the underlying thing. Well, then we need to start asking questions comparable to the God hypothesis. What type of relations, properties, or underlying terms? Is it one field? How many excitations? How complex is its geometry? Is it unlimited? How many properties? What do these properties have? Does it have any boundary conditions? Does it have arbitrary limits? These are all assumptions that go into a naturalistic explanation that need to be explained. Whereas with theism, we have a far less brute facts. Just God is a perfect being who is unlimited, explains where value comes from. Very simple. He said Death stars and rabbits are improbable, but again, according to his own research, he says and he just said there are infinitely many things that can come out of the nothing state. So how could he say they are improbable? What in nothing, your nothing state that gives rise to the universe, what in there makes this kind of rule that says Death stars and rabbits are more improbable? Nothing. So you unfortunately, it appears you're contradicting yourself there. And again, nothing cannot produce everything or something. His nothing state is completely illogical. It cannot give rise to anything because there is no things there to cause. So but he said somehow nothing collapses to nothing naturally. What? That doesn't make any sense. Nothing is nothing. It doesn't collapse into anything. He brought up the paper, Spontaneous Creation of Universe Ex Nihilo, which he cited, but what they're saying actually more aligns with my view. I'm not saying they're theists, but I mean, they say the notion of bit-based information at the core of the universe evolvement is not new. This trend suggests that the physical world is made of information with energy and matter as incidentals. They're not saying the universe came out of nothing. They're saying it came out of information processing, which is not nothing, it's something. And that's more in line with the idealist perspective. I'm not saying they're going that far, but I'm saying this is not in line with his nothing state. It doesn't even logically follow. He said that God is so complex, why posit that? Well, again, now you have to just posit solipsism. Because if you're gonna say we need to just go with the simple, you should just posit your mind and we're all figments of your mind's imagination. Why posit a bunch of extra complex minds out there, billions on this planet, if we just are going with simplicity here? It's more about parsimony. Now, again, you could say his explanation is simple, but it's not explaining things. It just is. Okay? We still need to account for why the universe exists, why brains somehow produce consciousness, why there is moral realism, and many other aspects. This is not an actual full explanation at this point. So that needs to be talked about. And again, positing complexity is not wrong. We do this all the time in science to explain phenomena we see. But again, if we read, for example, many philosophers like Gage and Doherty, they say this, but of course many theologians have thought that God must not reason discursively as we reason, but in a simpler manner. Following Augustine, Aquinas thinks that God knows everything that can be known in a single timeless act and as a single all-conjunctive thought. Dawkins could quibble with the theology, but this just shows that one simply can't do philosophy of religion without doing theology. And he does not seem ready or willing or able to do the requisite theology. Also, Swinburne argues that sum and detail, that attributing infinite power is simpler than attributing a finite quality, and illustrates this from the history of science. So it's much actually simpler as form of an ontology to posit a being that's just unlimited in power knowledge, goodness, then having some sort of arbitrary limit. Why does it only go this far? Well, you need an explanation for that. So when we posit perfect being theism, as Brian Leftow, Joshua Sijawadis pointed out, this is a very simple ontology. You're just positing a mind that's unlimited. So, for example, to give an analogy, many centuries ago, people used to think that you just keep going faster, infinite speed. Well, that's just a reasonable assumption until we found an actual limit with Einstein for like the speed of light, for example. We have a reason to posit a limit. But without that, there's no reason to posit a limit. That is a simpler explanation that's more parsimonious. Same with God. God is a simple explanation, although a simple ontology, that of the mind, can have a complex thought or do complex things. It's still a simple ontology, which can account for the data that we have in a much better way than positing something like space-time somehow is the explanation, but it also appears emergent, appears to come from a mind, somehow creates conscious minds and moral realism, and has all these weird arbitrary limits, arbitrary properties. This is about a very complicated explanation. We can't confuse explanation in ontology with the actions or the beyond that kind of aspect of it. So again, it's about a simple ontology. As philosophers have noted, the mind has a very simple ontology. And again, we can account for all this data. Unfortunately, when it comes to the data I presented, we still have not got a better explanation that can account for all the data I presented in a more parsimonious manner.
Thank you very much for that 5-minute rebuttal. Final rebuttal. 5 minutes from Dr. Richard Carrier. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I'll start with the last one. I think again Michael's misunderstood the argument. So let me give it in a different form. So let's say you have a collection of all possible things. It's infinite, and there's every possible God is in there. Every possible godless world is in there, and if you look at like the possible worlds, and there could be a world that you choose that has one universe in it only, a world that you choose that has no universes, that would be nothing, and nothing stays nothing. Or you could pick out of that hat essentially a mass, 10,000 universes or whatever. The number of universes that exist, the multiverse you pick out of there. All these possibilities are in there. Any one of them could be any possible multiverse or single verse and so on. But if you look at when you pick through all of that, the probability of picking a zero universe, in other words, nothing, is infinity to 1 against, right? Picking one single universe by itself, also infinity to 1 against. And even picking either one of those, 0 or 1, is also infinity to 1 against, because there's always an infinite number of larger multiverses to pick. So in fact, if you pick at random out of that hat, you are going to almost certainly pick a godless multiverse because of all the possible things that are in there. That's the most common thing by far. There's infinitely more of those things and more rare things like a god. Now, God has infinite specified complexity because he has absolutely he's literally Aleph Omega. You can look this up of all the connections that he could possibly make in his mind. To be omnipotent or to be omniscient is the most specified complexity that you can even have. It's like nothing can be logically more complex than that and more specified complex than that. But there's only one of those. Out of all the things in the hat, only one of those is that God. But almost all, in fact, infinitely many in that hat are godless multiverses. So if you're picking at random, you're not going to get a god. You're to an infinity to 1, you're going to get a random godless multiverse of vast size. And so the Lincoln-Wasser model, they don't actually have any positing of limits. There's no ad hoc anything in there. They just say that if you start with a state that has no physical laws governing what will happen, it logically necessarily follows that what will happen will be random. It'll be a random pick out of that hat. And they build this out in terms of describing it in terms of field theory. There are no assumptions that are plugged in there. Nothing's ad hoc. It's just simply once you define the state, the conclusion follows necessarily. And I bring this out in my many articles about this, but the best one to start with is nothing is a field state, is where I talk about Lincoln-Wasser and tie it into my other argument. So if you're picking at random, you're going to get a multiverse, and therefore it's actually a much simpler explanation. God is a much more complex piece of information. So Swinburne was actually wrong about that. So that argument doesn't work. It actually works the other way around. God is actually the most complex thing that you can pick. A multiverse is the least complex because of all the random things that you could pick at random. And that's the simplest thing you can do is pick at random. You're not specifying anything. It is zero specificity. You're picking at random. You're going to get a godless multiverse of all the possible things in that hat. So that's why I'm saying that's a simpler. So it also hits precedent. Again, We have no precedent for supernatural causes. God is the least likely explanation for anything you run into. It's always been thousands and thousands, millions and millions of things have been explained with natural causes. And so the probability is going to be one of these natural causes. Lincoln-Wasser is an example of this. So we got precedent. Then we've got simplicity. The Lincoln-Wasser model is vastly simpler, has vastly fewer posits, and requires less specificity of choice in terms of what happens than the God hypothesis does. And so I do want to revisit, what's my time on that?
121.
Okay, let's see if I can get through the moral argument, because I think that's been, he mentioned that a little bit, and I should hit that some. So let's do the same thing I did before. Let's put all the evidence in that Michael's leaving out. So atheism predicts that moral rules will only come from human beings and thus will begin deeply flawed and will be improved by experiment over a really long time, each improvement coming after empirically observing the social chaos and dissatisfaction and waste that comes from flawed moral systems. Atheism also predicts that will happen only slowly over thousands of years because humans are imperfect reasoners. And that is exactly what we observe. Just look at the examples of endorsing slavery and the subordination of women in the Bible, 1 Timothy 2, for example. By contrast, theism predicts a universe directly governed by justice laws or a kind and just stewardship, or the enacting and teaching of divine justice and mercy everywhere from the start. But we observe no such laws built into the universe, no stewards or law enforcers but us, and no perfect moral code has existed anywhere throughout history. The best moralities have always just slowly evolved from human trial and error. That's exactly what we would have to observe if God doesn't exist, but it is weird. It is not what we expect to observe if God did exist. If God did exist, we should see perfect moralities taught from the beginning for the last 40,000 years or 2,000, 4,000 years of writing and so on. And so that's why morality establishes my position.
Thank you very much. We have the 20-minute open dialogue. Got the timer set. The floor is yours, gentlemen.
Thank you, Dr. Carrier. Question about what you said there. You said pick something out of a hat. Are you talking about your nothing state?
Yeah, I'm responding to your discussion of my nothing state. Yeah.
Okay, so you pick
the unstable nothing model. Yeah.
The unstable nothing. What is unstable in nothing?
So, yeah, if you want to get into that. Now, I'm assuming you know the answer to this, but so what I do in this argument, and what Lincoln and Wasser do as well, is that you have to assume that once you take everything away, so to get to a nothing, you take everything away, you have at least one geometric point of space-time, because you can't have less than zero of something. So there's always at least the potential of something existing. There's no way to get rid of it without logical contradiction. You can't have a nothing more nothing than that. So what you have is a field state in which nothing is in it. Basically, no physical laws exist.
So just to be clear, it's a field state, though.
I mean, that's just a way to describe it, right? So it's basically describing a state of nothing. I mean, they use the language of physics. I use the more colloquial terminology. You can just think of it as there is a 0 point that has nothing at it. It has the least, that's all space-time removed, all time removed, so there's absolutely nothing there. But consequently, at that one point, nothing dictates what will happen next. Nothing dictates that it will stay nothing. So if nothing dictates that it will stay nothing, there's only one, you can work it out, there's only one other option, which is that every possibility has to be equally likely, because there's no rules governing that. No rule makes any one option more likely than any other, because no rules exist. So once you start from that assumption, you get that. Now, even if you want to say we have to posit at least this geometric point that has this quality, I can grant that, because if we have the single point that has it's a random potential, has no laws governing what it will do. If that's our one brute fact, the thing we have to posit, I'll grant that. And that's still vastly simpler than God.
If you have nothing, how do you have possibilities out of nothing?
This is what I'm explaining. So let's say that let's get away from the word nothing, because there's different definitions of the word nothing. I think it's tripping.
Define it, please.
Yeah, well, there's too many. So let's skip nothing. Let's forget the nothing part, because I think it's distracting you. Let's just say it's something. Let's say it's a quantum point. Like it's a something. It exists. Nothing causes it. It's just there. It's a brute fact. Let's just say that. So we're not even talking about nothing. We're just talking about this thing. This thing has no properties other than that it exists, and that it has no laws governing what will happen to it. So that's basically three propositions, super simple propositions. Once you start with those three propositions, you inevitably get an infinite multiverse because of the randomness effect. It would be infinity to one against.
You said there's no laws or rules. How do you get this multiverse out of this one dot?
Right. So if there are no rules governing what will happen, then every possible thing that can happen is equally likely. Because otherwise, if there was one thing, like let's say, like if nothing stays nothing, you're talking about a rule. A rule is governing it. Something is keeping it staying nothing. Not only that, it's selecting nothing to a high probability over all the others, but that requires a rule, some sort of force or power that's deciding this.
You said there are no rules here.
Exactly.
So then, if that follows, there's also no causal principles, there's no ability to, there's no potentialities, there's no actualities, there's nothing that can actually give rise.
The description is that. So that's the thing, is this is the actuality that actually does the
Actuality of nothing.
Effect. It is, so forget the nothing. I think you're getting distracted by the word nothing. Let's pretend it's not nothing. Let's say it's a thing. It is a something.
Thing. Yeah. Thing created everything else.
This little bubble, let's just call it a little bubble, has zero size, zero time, and it has just two properties. One, no laws govern what will happen, and it exists. So those are the only two rules.
How does that thing then create?
If no laws govern what will happen, then every possibility is equally likely. So every following event is equally likely. So for that bubble to stay a bubble and never change and never produce anything is infinity to one against, because zero outcomes is one option among all the infinite possible outcomes.
But there's also no causal principles. There's no actual descriptions.
That is the causal principle.
So it does have causal principles then.
That it is necessarily an effect of the description of the bubble.
So this bubble has the ability to cause other things.
It logically necessarily does.
Okay, so we're talking about a thing that causes other things. Does it just do it by itself?
Well, yeah, essentially.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what things exist that are able to act on their own?
What, currently in our universe here?
Can you give me anything?
Yeah, well, we live in a universe that is governed by exigent laws, so we aren't in this bubble. This bubble has no laws governing it, so we're not located there. We've never seen what this looks like because there's no such place in our universe.
So there's a thing not governed by laws that has the ability to create everything.
Well, there was once.
Okay.
Right.
So that sounds awfully a lot like a mind. It can act upon itself to do other things.
So you know what the difference is? A mind is intelligently selecting the outcome. This has no intelligent selection whatsoever.
So
it is literally random. The outcome is literally random, and you can show that there are infinitely more random outcomes that produce a vast multiverse without a God in it than would produce a God or only one universe or no universe, etc.
Again, we still need to actually explain how this thing creates. What you're saying when there's no laws, hold on, when it says there's no laws, that's a negative statement. Negative statements are not facts. They're just the absence of facts. We need actual facts to explain how this nothing state or this bubble is able to go from that to a universe. We need actual descriptions. We need actual causal principles. We need actual explanations here. Just saying, well, nothing constrains it, therefore it can be anything. That's not an explanation.
Yeah, if you just assume that when nothing determines, that's the thing. So absence of facts is a fact, right? So like
What's the fact then?
So for example, you might say from nothing, nothing comes, right? You might say that, ex nihilo nihil, right? Well, that's a fact. That's a positive fact. That is a positive fact that does not exist at this bubble because it hasn't been created yet.
But you said it's a thing now, though. So it's a thing now.
The ex nihilo isn't because it doesn't exist yet.
But so you said let's throw out the word nothing.
Yeah,
now
that's
it's a bubble. So
yeah, I'm okay with that.
So out of this bubble comes the universe. How? Why?
Because that rule, out of nothing, nothing comes, doesn't exist there. So
yeah, you said it's a thing.
Logically necessarily the case that if it is not true that nothing entails nothing, then it logically necessarily is the case that nothing will become one random thing.
So now we're back to it being nothing.
Yeah, except, well, okay, I'm sorry, bubble.
Okay,
so sorry, I'm jumping
why
around
are we bringing
on
up
language.
that nothing causes nothing if you're saying it's a bubble that somehow
if
created the universe?
If the bubble is not constrained by any law that says it has to stay a bubble, and is not constrained by any law that dictates what will happen, it is logically necessarily the case that every possible outcome is equally likely.
What constrains it to say that every outcome is equally likely?
Logical necessity is
then it's
logically
constrained by
necessarily
something,
the case.
Then it's constrained by something.
Well, remember, logical impossibility is things that literally can't exist. So there's no one has to dictate that. There's not like you can turn off logical necessity and you can somehow have contradictory things, right? Logical necessity simply just is. Like there's no way to get around it. You can't have logically contradictory things because a logically contradictory thing is by definition a thing that doesn't exist.
But this is somehow, okay, so let's go with that. We have a bubble, somehow brings about the universe, okay? Mm-hmm. You keep going back and forth between nothing or a bubble. Again, how does this bubble act upon itself if there's nothing constraining it to create a universe?
It doesn't have to act on itself. It's not like it's not making decisions. It simply has the property that a random thing will happen.
So it does have properties.
Yeah, I said that.
Okay, so it has properties, so it's not nothing.
Yeah.
So why would you bring up that out of nothing comes nothing?
Yeah, when I said, it has that property.
So
this is the simplest property you could possibly have.
Bubble
it's vastly
has
simpler than God.
properties that can cause other things to exist then.
It's just one property, which is the property of becoming anything.
So it can become
It has
anything.
no other properties
So, okay.
other than existing.
So then it's constrained by something, by that property.
Let's say that, sure.
Okay, so you're not positing nothing. You're
Yeah.
actually positing
Now,
something.
To be fair, we've gotten off track. So people want to read my article. I prove that it is logically necessarily the case, so that I'm not just ad hoc presupposing this. But for the sake of this debate that we're having right here, I'm willing to grant that. So let's just say that this is an ad hoc supposition. It's a brute fact, no explanation. It just is. So you have the bubble and you have this one property. That's it. And let's assume that I can't prove that they're logically necessarily the case. I actually do prove that they're logically necessarily the case elsewhere, and you can look into that proof. But let's, for the sake of this argument, assume that's not the case. Let's assume these are my brute facts, just those two things.
Okay, so then,
Those two things are vastly simpler than God. So if you're going to pick starting points at random, mine is actually way
so
simpler.
we're positing
than
a
yours.
bubble that has causal powers, and then it creates a universe with conscious agents.
Well, it creates a multiverse,
Okay.
right? It's going to
Even
be
bigger.
near infinite multiverse. If you pick a number at random from all possible numbers, it's going to be unimaginably large.
Why? Why does it do that?
I mean, if every number has an equal probability, if you add up the infinite number, let's pick a number 10 to the 5,000th power. So that's a huge number,
So
right?
then anything is probable.
Everything is possible. So each particular thing has an equal probability. So each number of universes has an equal probability. So if you pick a number at random, number of universes at random, from all possible numbers of universes, you can show that there's always infinitely more universes than any finite number you choose. So the probability that it's going to be an unimaginably vast number is infinity to 1. This is basic
Again,
math.
as we said, you said anything is equally probable, right?
Yeah, each thing.
So then everything is equally probable. How could this universe be more probable on a godless view if everything is equally probable?
That's the multiverse point, right? So if you pick a number at random from all possible numbers, your number is going to be near infinity, the number you pick. It won't be a low number because if you pick, let's say 5, let's say 1,000 even, let's pick 1,000. There are infinitely more things to pick above that, right? So the sum of probability of all of those is infinite, whereas the sum of probability for those 1,000 things is only the sum of 1,000 things.
So
right?
this bubble with causal principles can create anything it wants.
Logically necessarily, from how I've described it. It's
How is that
inevitable.
not God?
Well, it doesn't have a mind.
Well,
It's
wait a
not
minute, wait a
thinking,
minute.
it's not
How
intelligent.
does something without a mind cause other things on its own
I
when it's
already
not being
explained
acted
that.
on and it has the ability to do anything it wants? So please explain again.
It
because-
doesn't want anything. It doesn't have desires. I only posited two
Wait,
things.
okay, so now we're positing
It
another
exists-
arbitrary limit.
No,
It
no,
can't have
It-
desires.
I'm saying it has two properties. It exists, and anything can happen that's equal. Anything can happen.
And it can't be a mind.
I'm not saying it can't be. I'm proposing a theory. You're proposing a theory. I'm proposing a theory. I'm saying my theory is, and I don't necessarily think this is necessarily true. There are many other possible theories. I'm just defending this as a possible theory. I think it's plausible. But my theory is that there's this one thing that has these two properties. That thing is vastly simpler than God because it doesn't have desires, doesn't have a mind, it doesn't have any of the other properties that you actually think God has. Other than you could probably argue through a semantic argument that it's omnipotent.
So this is a non-sentient bubble that somehow has the ability to create things even though it's not acted upon.
It just
and
randomly does it.
It
yeah.
just randomly does it.
That's the posit.
Does
And
it-
if it randomly does something, you get an infinite multiverse. So
What
this
what
brute
principle
fact is way
explains that?
simpler than God.
Well, again, that's another brute fact, is
yeah.
it not?
Yeah, that's fine.
Forgive me, gentlemen. I'm willing to. I personally find this super interesting so that I kind of want to keep going, but I also just want to remind you that we're 12 minutes through the 20 minutes total
Yeah.
in case there were any other topics you did want to
point.
discuss.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I'll defer to you guys because I got to be honest, I'm enjoying it so much.
Yeah,
that-
I'm
So
cool.
with
I'm
with
happy what you
consciousness,
want to do.
it
Actually,
brings consciousness out of it, though, doesn't it?
say again?
It brings consciousness out of it, doesn't it, though?
Well, consciousness evolved, right? That was the previous argument.
that's an assumption. We don't have any evidence for.
We have tons of evidence for that.
We have a correlation.
The evolution of the mind is super slow. We got worms, rats, all monkeys, apes,
And
all
they're
the way to
less
humans.
conscious than us?
Well, it depends on how you're measuring consciousness.
Self-awareness.
Again, that's what do you mean by that?
Exactly.
So do they experience qualia? Do they experience the redness of red, the smells of things, and like that? Do they have an experiential theater? And do they relate those things to itself in some way? Maybe it doesn't have a model of its entire brain. Obviously apes, or let's say cats, don't necessarily have knowledge of themselves, but they do place themselves in their environment when they're modeling it. So they do relate the environment to themselves in some sense. And so that model is what creates conscious experience. And we know this because you can remove the pieces and get the conscious experience out. We know this because we have the brain is massively complicated, and so this massively complicated machine always has to be working for consciousness to arise. And we have the long evolutionary history of it slowly growing up and building and building and building until we get to self models, which is the full self model of the human.
So, in your view, consciousness do lower animals are not conscious? Like, does it come out of complex brain processing?
So I said you have to specify what you mean by conscious. I think that there is a point. Let's say worms. I don't actually know where it is, but there may be a point where the informational value of its model building is so low that it doesn't experience qualia. But mice, lizards, probably.
So how does consciousness come out of brain processes? I mean, we just can't say, well, it does. Explain how it actually does.
Yeah. So that's where you got to get to, like, operationally, what is consciousness, right? So we pick a thing. So let's say there's a mouse in here somewhere. No one's noticed it yet. And it's looking around. It will detect objects. It will detect routes that it could go through. It will see colors. It will hear sounds. And it's integrating all of this into a model, and it's using that model. It's a virtual model in its head. It's using this virtual model to figure out what to do, where to run, where to hide, et cetera. So it has desires. That's part of the model. It has can see things. It's making distinctions between things. It's doing all this. The computer in its brain is doing all of this. And that's what it is. So if you were to interfere with that computer, if you were to turn it off, for example, its consciousness will go away. If you were to cut out the piece that does the color red, it won't see the color red anymore.
But seeing red is not consciousness, though. You can see red or not see red and still be conscious.
So I'm trying to figure out what you're trying to get at.
I'm trying to get at what consciousness actually comes from.
It's true that you don't have to. You can have your eyes closed and not see colors.
Okay, then cutting out that part of the brain or blinding me is not consciousness.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that's what causes the redness. By cutting it out, we can prove that the redness is being generated by that computer circuit, because when you remove it, it's gone.
It's correlation, causation?
Well, in this particular case, it is, because we can triangulate.
What's the evidence for that?
Because we can triangulate. Not only can we remove it, we can stimulate it. So we can actually activate it with an electrode, and the color red, we experience it.
And that's just evidence of a correlation, though, right?
But notice it's from two different directions. And then you get comparative anatomy, which animals can see red. And then we get evolutionary history, so how that component grew over time and how it was selected for by evolution and so on. So all of this convergent lines of evidence shows that redness, or experience, or any experience of redness, is the product of a computation, and a specific computation.
And I'm asking how it
we
comes
can
out of that
locate.
computation.
We actually know where it is.
I'm asking how it comes out of the computation, because we can look at the brain.
Well,
what is consciousness?
It is the computation, right? So that's the
so
Dennett.
It's a process.
That's the Dennett-Cottrell model.
So am I talking to a conscious agent or a process?
Those are the same thing. They're identical.
So how would it be different than just talking to a river? If it's just a process, you're not actually here.
A river doesn't have the computational circuit to build models and explore them.
You need to also show the brain does that.
We have done.
That's
we
an
have,
assumption.
We've got no, it's not. We got neural structure. There's tons of neuroscience on the computational structure of the brain. For example, I have a whole literature.
Which paper has shown that they've shown how consciousness?
So,
comes out
for
of the brain?
example, I have a whole bunch. There's one of my articles on Bayesian reasoning. There's a ton of science showing that the brain's computations, calculating the colors and shapes of things, are Bayesian. They actually follow the Bayesian mathematical model, which is basically just a simple mathematical computer model that our brain is actually doing. And we have tons of these convergent lines of evidence showing that consciousness is the process of modeling things. It is a computerized virtual model.
How does that actually come out of it? Just saying that it is doesn't actually make an explanation.
So
if you're positing a physical,
I don't know what you mean by
let me
come
finish
out.
I
think
what
you mean is,
let me finish what I'm saying then.
Like, what would
let me
make
finish what I'm saying then.
If I understand with the river example, I think what you're asking is, what's the difference between a computer that generates consciousness and another computer?
I would basically run John Sear's Chinese room argument. If you
it's a
computation itself, we can see computation without actually consciousness coming out or actually understanding or knowing. So you have computation. Okay, that doesn't actually show consciousness coming out of it, because we can see computation without it. So you have a correlation in the brain. I agree. That's not evidence of a causation. You say it is. I'm asking for that evidence. You've not given it so far.
It's all the convergent lines of evidence. It's very improbable that there would be all those convergent lines of evidence unless it's causal. Right? That comes out of Pearl, which is one of the standard textbooks on how we determine causality.
But idealism predicts this kind of correlations. We predict that if you're a conscious agent, you're going to look like something in reality.
I mean, I don't really know. I don't really study what the actual. There aren't any scientific articles on idealism as a actual explanation.
Well, that's
or
because there's a
anything.
metaphysical theory.
The point being is you're asking me what the science is on idealism, and that there isn't any.
I'm
Because
asking
there's
you,
no way
because
to
you
do
said
this
you were going to hold to a
scientifically.
physicalist theory. You say
No,
the
I'm
brain
saying there's
creates
tons of
consciousness.
papers, tons
we
of
need
science
actual
on this.
evidence the brain creates consciousness other
Yeah.
than just correlation.
We have tons of
And again,
evidence.
the consciousness,
It's not
there's a
just
reason
correlation.
it's called the hard problem. It's because we cannot reduce subjectivity to just computational processes. As even Sam Harris
totally
admitted.
can.
Even
Dennett's
Sam Harris
done this.
admitted
Cottrell's
this.
done this.
Even Sam Harris has admitted that if you just open the brain, you're not going to get like the subjective experience that is supposed to be coming out of it. That's what we need evidence for.
That's completely the wrong way that you do it. The only way to have the experience is to be the computation, right? You can't watch a computer and know what the computer is doing, right? So you would have to actually be the computer to know what it's doing.
So you have to actually be the thing itself. Then,
Yeah,
right?
that's the basic physics, right?
So
there,
then,
right?
okay, so Louis, let's go with that then. Okay, so if you are the thing, you can't actually see consciousness, right?
I mean,
There's no way to observe it, right?
I mean, see, you're talking about vision with the eye.
There's no way to observe it, though, according to you.
You are observing it because you're it.
Okay, but there's no way to observe it from the outside then, though, right?
Well, you can observe that it's going on. So it's just like if you're watching a computer.
That's not what I asked. There's no way to observe it, right?
Well, it's logically necessarily the case that the only way you can experience consciousness is to be the computer. There's no.
But if we can't
other
observe
way
it,
to
it's
do
not physical because physical things can be
It
observed
doesn't-
from the
that's a
outside.
non-sequitur.
How come we can't observe it?
It's a non sequitur. The reason you can't
It's
observe
an
it
inference. It's an inference.
because if you're just looking at a computer, like you're just staring at a microchip, you can't play a video game, right? You have to actually run the chip. And then you have to interface with the monitor and with the controls and
We
stuff.
can observe all that, though, right?
Yeah.
That's physical stuff.
In that particular case,
Why
yeah.
can't
But
we observe
notice you have
consciousness?
to actually run it, and so you have to actually be running the process to see it. The analogy, if you want to see like a third party, is when you see me behaving a certain way, you see the video game running. But the only way to be on the inside of me is to literally be on the inside of me. You have to be the computer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's
my
a
point,
logically
though.
necessary case, though. So it doesn't argue against physicalism. Physicalism already entails that would be the case. There's no other way that you can
Physicalism will
observe
tell
it.
that we can observe consciousness in some sort of physical process, and we haven't been able to do this. This is the problem.
Physicalism
It's a
doesn't
hard
entail
problem.
that in the sense that you mean. So I think you're engaging in sort of semantic switching here. We can observe consciousness. We can actually put you in a brain scan, and we can tell when you're conscious and when you're not. So we can
That's
do it
not
that way.
that's not observing consciousness. That's
I
another
know.
correlation, though. This is
But
my
you
point.
keep term switching between different concepts of observation.
How can
so
consciousness be reducible? That was my point.
that's what I've been explaining for like 2 hours.
I hate to do it, gentlemen, but that was a fantastic
Yeah.
open discussion. We are going to jump into the 5-minute closings before we go to Q&A.
Okay.
And the timer is set for you, Mike, for your 5-minute closing.
Well, again, what is a better explanation of all the data we have? It's going to be theism. Or you can posit a bubble that has causal powers. It's somehow in a nothing state, but is also something, so it's not in a nothing state, that somehow gives rise to everything, even though it's not actually a sentient thing. It just does. We're positing unnecessary bruteness. We're positing arbitrary aspects of this thing, properties it has that are unexplainable. It just has them. It has the ability to create a vast, complex universe, create conscious beings, moral realism, but it's definitely not a mind, even though it looks and acts like a mind and does things only minds can do. If you start with just a bubble that creates everything, it has to actually be able to do something. Therefore, it has to be self-aware is my point. If it's not self-aware, it doesn't actually. And he just said it just arbitrarily has these causal principles to create this vast universe. That doesn't follow. But again, on his website, he was saying that it is absolutely nothing. He said, in the problem with nothing, the assertion ex nihilo nihilo, from nothing comes only nothing, is false, because that is a rule, and nothing contains no rules. No such rule can therefore exist when there is nothing, so as to govern that nothing. Therefore, it cannot be the case that only nothing comes out of nothing. In fact, we cannot even establish that that is likely, that only nothing will come out of nothing. Yes, we can, from the very aspects of what causal principles entail. Okay? It is just completely false that nothing could ever bring about something. It is false that a non-sentient thing could bring about a vast universe. Now, he says, well, you're compositing something complex. By his own logic, he should be a solipsist. He should not be positing a world where all of you are individual conscious minds, because that's more complexity. He should just be a solipsist, and that we are all figments of his own mind's imagination. And again, it's not wrong to posit complexity to explain the facts that we have. This is why we are positing a mind as the explanation of reality. A mind best explains why the universe is as it is. It explains why the universe appears emergent, it explains consciousness, moral realism, all these aspects that I covered. Okay? What we didn't get is an actual explanation that can account for all that data. All we got is, well, this bubble can do it, ad hoc. Well, why? We know why a mind can do those things. It flows out of the very nature of a mind. Again, we're only two principles I need are the nature of God, who is a mind, who's unlimited, because we don't posit arbitrary limits, which, again, would be more explanations that don't need, and axology. He's going to create worlds that are valuable, like this one. There's plenty of value here. This actually explains all the data. My opponent just says, well, the bubble, the magical bubble, does it. Well, what's the explanation as to why it does it? What's the explanation that brains bring about consciousness? Well, they just do. It's computation. But we can see that these are just correlations. And again, these are not actual explaining all of the data. This is my big problem with atheism. It doesn't actually account for all of the data. It just says, yeah, well, it does. And again, if he's going to say that this universe is more probable on a godless hypothesis, but his own nothing state says that everything is equally probable. So he can't say this is more probable. In fact, out of the nothing state, why couldn't he just say that, well, a universe with God it comes out, therefore God exists? There's just absurdity here. Out of nothing comes nothing. That is just true. No philosopher would deny that. Okay? You just can't say out of nothing comes the vast universe and conscious agents. It's much easier to start a simpler, more parsimonious explanation, to start with a mind that explains the facts that I've laid out here. So theism actually explains far more with much less, a much simpler ontology. And what we get with non-theism is a magic bubble, I guess. I don't know. There's not really an explanation for why it does these things or why these things come out of it. We just are told, well, it can. But it's definitely not a mind, even though it's able to act and do things randomly. These are arbitrary aspects that need explained, making the hypothesis more and more ad hoc. So this is not a more probable explanation. Again, as I said in my opening statement, when we have all these different aspects of reality, one explanation accounts for them all. Theism does. Why should we take non-theism when it doesn't account for all this data, or we have to come up with different explanations? Notice he's going to do the bubble state, as I went over. Then somehow brains create consciousness, which again, we just see correlations. Then somehow we have moral realism and trying to do a natural moral realism, which I don't have time to get to, is going to suffer from the open question argument. Because whatever he says is good, I can just ask, why is that good? Why should we aim for that kind of thing? But again, moral ontology shows that absolute goodness is personal nature. And that has not been accounted for either. Thank you. But I appreciate the time. Thank you, Dr. Carrier, for the debate. I had a lot of fun.
Thank you, Mike, for that closing. And Dr. Carrier, the floor is all yours.
Yeah. So just positing an infinite God is no more plausible than just positing an infinite multiverse. You're both are just positing infinite things just there for no reason. So if we just grant that infinity is to be expected to be the first starting thing, we could just say that, well, it's an infinite multiverse. They're just infinite universes because that's simpler somehow. The same argument that would get an infinite God to be simple also gets you infinite multiverse. So that is really a no-go argument. What is actually better is that if you can get an infinite multiverse from a vastly simpler starting point, then you win on the epistemic quality of simplicity. You have fewer ad hoc assumptions. You're assuming a much less lucky outcome. So if you're going to assume that you just happen to have an infinite multiverse, we just happen to have an infinite God, you're trusting an infinite amount of luck. Whereas if you say that we can get all of the stuff that we observe with just a very super simple starting point, simple quantum false vacuum or whatever, then you're actually picking something that is vastly more likely because it doesn't have this massive improbability attached to it. It's much, much simpler. It requires a lot less selection. Okay, so I want to get to the semantics of nothing. Let's put that aside. I think it's playing games with words. If you want to know how I define nothing in this argument, that's in the papers. You can go to my blog and look for the nothing argument, and you'll see what I mean by nothing and why I mean that and what are different kinds of nothing and so on. Let's set aside nothing. That's why I think for the purpose of this debate, it's easier to just not get distracted by the semantics of the word nothing. Let's just say that it is a quantum bubble. Let's say it's a something. It's a thing. And it has only one mindless, simple property, which is just to randomly be anything else. And every possibility has an equal probability, and so when you do that, an infinite multiverse is a logically inevitable outcome of that to infinity to 1. Now, if you compare that super simple bubble theory, this exists for no reason, we're just lucky we got this bubble or whatever, That's super simple, whereas an infinite perfect mind is infinitely more complex and therefore infinitely more improbable of all the things that you could end up with. So the bubble theory wins by being infinitely simpler. So we win on simplicity. That simple bubble, that brute fact, let's call it that, logically entails an infinite multiverse, which logically entails everything that we observe now, so it wins on simplicity. But it predicts the following. We would only observe mindless causes of everything. Well, that's what we observe. So we have precedent on our side. So that's one observation that already confirms the bubble theory over the God theory. We would see minds only as products of super complex machines that evolved slowly over vast ages of time by mindless natural selection. Also what we observe. That's exactly what we'd have to observe if that's what happened. The God theory does not predict this and even doesn't even make it likely. We would see morals start out rather shoddy and bad and only slowly get improved by humans desiring a more livable society and a way to be more congruent with their desire of what sort of people they want to be. And this is what psychology has found and so forth. And that's why the moral good, is because that is what we need in order to get all the other things that we want, which is a cooperative society and the good faith and benefit of friendship and camaraderie and cooperation, and also to be right with ourselves in terms of what sort of person we want to be when we self-reflectively think about what sort of person we are, when we act a certain way and compare that to how people treat us. Okay, so that we have a lot of that science. I think I might get into more of that in tomorrow night's debate, so if you really want to get into that, that's the thing. And that's really it. So and there's many others. We could go through biogenesis, we could go through the vastness of space, the fact that it's so old, so large, has so much dead stuff in it, why almost the entire universe is a lethal radiation-filled vacuum, and so on. All of these things are exactly what we would expect if on this bubble theory, right? This simple bubble theory. And so we get everything we observe exactly as we would expect, and none of this is what we expect on the theism theory. And the theism theory is needlessly complex and doesn't have any precedent behind it. And so that's my position on all of this. And I think ultimately it does require getting down to checking all of the things that we've talked about today. So what's my time left on that?
35 seconds.
Okay. Yeah, I want to say that this was actually one of the better God debates that I've done because Michael's arguing it at a higher level and coming up with some new ideas, not the same old stuff that I'm usually dealing with. So I like that about this debate. Everything that I've argued, you can find more detail on, citations of scientific studies and all of that stuff on my blog, so I would recommend going there. I imagine people will have questions, so let's do that.
Absolutely. That was fun indeed. I enjoyed that very much. Can we give a round of applause for the questions?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if you're like me, but getting to think through these different intricate ideas is so fun. I just get a real kick out of it just from both sides. So that was a great debate. And if you have questions, one thing too, let me know, Jeff, if there's a way that would make it easier for one of the cameras in the back to see the speakers still. You got it. Thanks, bud. All right, we will start with, looks like my guess you're maybe first or kind of in line. You're in line, right? Okay. Well, all right, well, we'll have you stand right about right here. That way so basically you want to be sure that this camera right here is able to see you guys. One thing too, I have to hold the camera just so nobody filibusters. And by the way, I've heard of this, I have 2 questions. We're not doing that, okay? Just one. All right, here we go.
Yeah, my question is actually for Mike. I just wanted to clarify here, and apologies if I missed this in your opening statement, but one of the presuppositions you made for the expanding mind was that presupposition 1 was that if the universe is expanding, it must be an expanding mind. Why is it? Am I misunderstanding? What was presupposition 1? I apologize.
Premise 1.
Premise 1, yes,
If the
sorry.
universe is emergent, it's emergent from a mind.
Why must it be from a mind? Was my
Well,
question.
that's kind of what I explained throughout the opening statement. So I defended the second premise first, the universe is emergent, and then I gave a couple different arguments. So one, so just to recap really quickly, again, if we have idealism, it just seems to be a much more parsimonious explanation. Minds behave quantum. This is what the study of quantum cognition shows, but the universe is fundamentally quantum, so the universe is behaving like our mind. So that's an inductive argument. And then you also use the similar research I used from Franco Vazza and Alberto Felitti, that what emerges from the universe matches very much a lot of the similarities with the brain. But on idealism, again, you have a conscious agent, and the brain is the image of that, so we would expect the same thing. So different arguments. People often ask, like, why does the universe come from a mind? Well, we have specific things in the universe that are actually pointing to that now. And I could do that even more with quantum mind theory. I don't actually say quantum mechanics creates consciousness. I just think it's another correlation.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. This is for Dr. Carrier. Mm-hmm. How can you understand a state of consciousness and qualify qualia and other species that experience and absorb the world differently? For example, tropical birds and mantis shrimp that see more colors in another spectrum, and do they have a higher level of consciousness?
So I'm always wary of words like higher and lower when we're talking about this. Different consciousness for sure. Different in the sense that they have experiences that we don't have. This gets to I have an article I should have mentioned earlier called on hosing thought experiments, and he mentioned Searle's Chinese room, which is a terrible argument, and I have that in there. But I also do Mary the scientist. So there's Mary's room is this thought experiment. That's kind of what you're talking about how. So let's say what is it? I can't remember if an octopus, how many colors they see, but. There's some weird, like, strange starfish-like animals that see like 16 colors or something. It's insane. So the question is, how would you know what it was like to see those colors? And so you would have to actually take the circuits that it has for generating that qualia, physically install them in your brain, connect it to the entire model that your computer is generating, and then you would have the experience of seeing those 16 colors. And they'd probably be colors that you can't even imagine because you can only imagine things on the computer mainframe that you have, and it only has circuits for the colors you know. So there are colors that you can't even imagine now, like it's physically impossible for you to imagine them, that you could then experience once you've had those circuits installed. I don't know if that answers your question, but it heads in the direction of how one might answer your question. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's interesting, so thank you. I appreciate it.
Not evidence of the subjective experience itself. Circuitry is just a correlation. This is what Thomas Nagel was saying when I quoted my opening statement. That you can have the circuitry without the feeling of pain.
That's a fair point. Because I didn't answer that part of your question. Mm-hmm. I don't know. May I, or do we want to move on?
If you can paraphrase that part of the question.
Yeah. So the question was, how do we know other animals experience qualia? Because we can't jump in their mind and do it. And so we know it through, against arguments from probability, right? We observe phenomena that's very improbable unless that is happening. And one of the examples of that are the cat dream experiments, where they put cats to sleep, put electrodes in their brain to turn off the part, because in your brain, when you go to sleep, there's a part of your brain that turns on, that dislocks your brain from your body, so when you imagine running, you're not spinning around in bed and stuff, so your body stays inert. When you do this, you turn that part off on cats, and cats are asleep. They dream, and they dream stalking rodents and things that don't exist. So we can watch them in the room stalking animals and moving around, even though they're completely asleep. They're just dreaming. We're watching their dream by watching by turning off the thing that when the dream it turns off the body, we turn that back on, and we can actually see them dreaming. It's very unlikely that process, like that cats would dream, that cats would specifically dream hunting prey, it's very unlikely that would happen unless they're having an experiential computation the same way we are.
Okay. This is for Dr. Carrier. Psychology is a social science investigating the mind and its experiences. There are different competing hypotheses, not scientific theories, about the mind and consciousness. Sounds like you've answered all these questions. How did you create the Carrier Unified Mind Theory, and when are you receiving your Nobel Prize?
I'm actually just repeating what others have already published, right? So I mentioned Alan Cottrell and Daniel Dennett. Others I could mention, Patricia Churchland. So there's actually a lot of people in brain science, cognitive science, who are building these models for understanding. Dennett's the most famous one, and his original theory in Consciousness Explained, which is an old book, they've expanded, built on that. So other scientists have built on his theory, and you can see that and look that up. And I cite a lot of this in my work, if you're interested in finding more of it. But you can also do Google Scholar. There's tons.
This is for Dr. Carrier. Most scholars and even most religions agree Jesus of Nazareth was a real man and a good moral teacher. So why would a good moral teacher blaspheme God by claiming divine authority, and why would he knowingly lead his followers into persecution and death?
Yeah, that's kind of off topic, but
I was waiting for it.
Yeah.
This is God. Is it off topic?
I mean, yeah. So Michael didn't defend specifically Christianity. He didn't appeal to Jesus or anything like that. So I mean, in a sense, it's unfair to him. Also, it's unfair to me. But it's not what I prepared. But I could answer that. So obviously, I think there's only a 1 in 3 chance that there even was a Jesus. And I have an academic peer-reviewed study on that. So people, in fact, meet me at the table after this when I'm going to be selling books. There's a lot I have on this stuff. But also, even if that 1 in 3 is hit and there was a historical Jesus, we don't actually know reliably what he taught, because we know this mainstream consensus is, if you want to follow the mainstream consensus, is that most of the things attributed to him were not actually said by him. So this makes it difficult to answer that question. But one popular model, like the Bart Ehrman model, is that he was an apocalyptic prophet who genuinely believed the world was going to end soon, and that he would return with an army of angels to defeat the Romans or whatever. So that's the Ehrman model. Entirely plausible. We have lots of examples of religious movements like this. You could talk about Jim Jones, Bar Kokhba, and so on. So the question is, why would people follow that? And the answer is because they believed it, right? Why did everybody die at Jonestown? They believed it, right? And that's the thing. If you convince people that they will live forever and that they either won't die or they'll die and God will resurrect them, you can get them to do almost anything. And so that would be the Ehrman explanation for that. And I think it's a plausible explanation. I don't think that's true. I think it's really a little more nuanced than that. But that would be my answer to that question.
Would you say nothing made him believe it?
I did, forgive me for doing it. It's just that, and then I want to encourage for future questions if they can be more on the content of the debate.
Yeah.
But I appreciate your question. No, it's all right. It's not a big deal.
Hi, I have a question about the bubble theory.
Okay.
And, if it's the most simple explanation of how everything came to be, wouldn't we have seen more models popping up of a bubble theory instead of everyone?
Would we see them? That's the question, right? No, we wouldn't, because, first of all, the bubble as defined ceases to exist once it changes into something else, right? And so that's it. And once it's gone, there is no other thing for that to happen to, right? And now there's that. In addition to that, we're inside a universe that it created that is governed by physical laws. So we cannot ever see one of those bubbles, because those bubbles can only exist where there are no physical laws, and there's no such location in this universe for us to go to observe those things. So that's why we don't see them. And in theory, there may be a time when we can start getting evidence and thus quote unquote see parallel universes. There's a lot of different ways that could happen, but they can also fall out of existing theories. And if those theories get proved by other evidence, then we would see them through the evidence that we have that those theories are true, and that's getting into standard cosmological science. Alan Guth and Vilenkin has he has his own theory. Guth has his own theory. They're really interesting theories that will explain all of this. But there's many others. I don't want to single them out. They're just the ones I know the best.
I guess I more so meant models of people groups coming up with a model for God instead of a model for a bubble. If it's the most simplistic explanation of how everything came to be.
Yeah. Well, see, what you're doing now is you're asking what's called the error theory of religion, which is explaining why did people start to believe in God at all, right? Why that idea of all the things. There's actually a lot of science on this. Dennett has a good book. Breaking the Spell. So his book, Breaking the Spell, is a summary of the psychology of religion, which is a whole scientific field. And there's tons of stuff. Guthrie and these other authors have written a lot of really good stuff in this. There's a lot of explanations. It's a complex explanation, yada, yada. But to give you one simple one, one of many that's in there, is the Guthrie point, which is called agency overdetection. So we've actually confirmed that our brains evolved to overdetect agents. And the reason that it does that is because it's deadlier to underdetect agents than to overdetect them. So it costs less to think God is moving the grass and be wrong about it than to think that the grass doesn't have a tiger in it and that's why it's moving, right? So if we forget the tiger, if we think, oh, it's no big deal, then the tiger eats us, yada yada. Whereas if we turn around and look and we say, oh, it's God doing it, that hurts us less. So we actually get to this point of agency over-detection. So our brains actually see gods everywhere. And that's why for thousands of years, and we can see all the earliest stuff for thousands of years before what we call monolatry, monotheism is what most people think of. It was polytheist. Starts with animism. Everything is a god. There's a god in the tree. There's a god in the sky. Every cloud has a god. So the gods are everywhere. You see agents everywhere. And then over time, it became more convenient to just aggregate those gods together and say, well, let's say all the cloud gods are one cloud god. Like, it's just easier to think that way. And then, of course, you say, well, then maybe it's just all one god, right? It goes through the phase of saying, wait, there's a supreme god that made all of those gods, and so on. And then eventually just fold them all up into one god. And so that process is not a rational process. It's not an evidence-based process. But it stems from our innately evolved cognitive biases in how we do it. So no one's actually thinking about the kinds of things that I'm talking about, which clearly we can see from how Michael was reacting and how I think some people in the audience were reacting. It may be a simple thing ontologically, but to understand it is pretty high-level stuff, so it's not that simple in terms of what it takes cognitive resource-wise to understand it.
Thank you.
Yeah, real quick, in reply to the hyperactive agency detection, I just want to say there's been several studies on this, like perceptual bias in relation to paranormal and conspiracy beliefs. They found no evidence link between theistic beliefs and hyperactive agency detection. A couple other studies, cited them in a video called "Are Atheists Biased?" So if anyone wants to check that out, you can see that there's no evidence hyperactive agency detection is related to theistic beliefs.
Are there any questions for Mike?
No.
Poor Mike. I just want to mix it up a little bit. So do you have a question for Mike?
Yeah, let's do that.
All right, let's let it rip.
He might not like it. So Mike, if the multiverse were proven to be true, would that mean that you would be a polytheist? And if so, would all of those gods be indigenous to those universes, or would they all be old white guys?
No, because I never posited a god in a universe.
Just a mind, right?
Just a mind.
Just a mind. Okay.
Yeah, I would assume, I don't know if it was clear. I get the impression that from his point of view, the multiverse would be a product of the one God. Right? So, yeah.
I'm next? Okay.
Yeah, one more for Mike just to try to balance it out a little bit.
Sure. I have like 5 questions I want to ask, but I'll just ask one. So if God is a maximally great being, then he necessarily is more complex than whatever God is the invocation for, the explanation of. And you invoked parsimony a lot tonight in the debate, but I think God's maximalness, I think that completely blows up God as ever being parsimonious to anything you're trying to explain. So I was just curious as to what your response to that would be.
Yeah, I'd appeal to people like Trent Doherty and Gage in their paper, as well as Richard Swinburne, that, again, it's about what do we mean by complexity? If we're talking about the ontology of God, it's actually quite simple. This is why philosophers like Sijuwati very recently has written about this, complaining, no, we have a very simple ontology. You posit a mind that's unlimited, and you have very limited bruteness. Brian Leftow has a paper on this as well. So it's one brute fact. You posit perfect being theism. And then you just have unlimits in terms of goodness, power, and wisdom in terms of that, or intelligence. So it doesn't actually follow this, that you have that complexity in the ontology, because it's not made of parts or anything like that. But a mind can do many complex things without having a complicated ontology. So we need to distinguish those things.
Is there like a clarification I can do?
Yeah, go ahead.
So like, are you committed to the idea that it is possible for God to not be the most complex thing then? Because I think you have to take that position.
It depends on what you mean by the most complex thing. In terms of ontology, yes.
If he's maximally everything, then complexity is just whatever complexity means. If he's maximal, I feel like he would have to be that. But for parsimony to maintain, he isn't necessary.
So we're assuming in the assumption there that to have power requires this sort of complexity. But that, I think, and I could be wrong, but there's an underlying premise that we're trying to shoveling in physicalism, that we need some sort of like complex computation. But we're talking about a mind in a simple ontology. It's not going to be built by parts or like complex computer parts, to use an analogy. We're talking about a simple mind in of itself that is not going to have that kind of parts. Again, it's just unlimited. This is why the philosophers of religion have talked about this as being a very simple ontology and explanation.
I think this may be our last one, folks. I think at most we can only get maybe 1 or 2 more.
Dr. Carrier, I find your precedent argument incredibly weak. First of all, it's a double standard. When naturalism,
I need a question, just to be sure
Yeah,
you get
take
the
a
question.
I will. When naturalism gets it wrong, Lamarckism, spontaneous generation, junk DNA, we're told that's a good thing because science is improving. But your version of naturalism on the topic of origins, which is the topic of the debate, has brought absolutely nothing to the table. A multiverse from nothing.
To press you for a question.
Okay, so the precedent on origins, Dr. Carrier, is you've brought nothing to the table. Pun intended.
Yeah, that's still not a question, but okay. I will comment, though, briefly.
I want to give. Go ahead.
Yeah. So when naturalism gets it wrong by proving a naturalist theory right. So the end result is always naturalism ends up being the explanation. The reason this is relevant is that it changes the prior probability of an explanation. So it's like if you're doing a UFO thing, you see a light in the sky. What is the most probable cause? You could list you could force rank the most probable causes of that light. UFO is going to be on the bottom of that list, right? And that's because of precedent in terms of what's usually been the case. That actually has a higher probability because of that. Now, that is, as I said at the beginning, I do not think this wins the argument. Precedent does not win the argument by itself. It is just one epistemic virtue. So you have to win on all three epistemic virtues. You can't just say precedent and get rid of God.
I wish we could go longer, folks. I really do, but I do want to try to keep us on track for dinner time. So I'm going to let everybody go for dinner, but want to say
I'll be selling books too, just FYI.
Oh, that's right. Table out there. One last round of applause for these debaters. That was fantastic.